In the early 7th century, the Tibetan plateau was a collection of decentralized warring clans. Life was governed by local chieftains and the shamanistic rituals of the Bon religion, with no central authority to bind the mountain tribes together. These communities shared one critical limitation that separated them from the neighboring superpowers in China and India. They were entirely pre-literate. There was no written form of the Tibetan language. This isolation began to dissolve under King Songtsen Gampo. He unified the plateau's disparate factions and established a permanent seat of power in a valley he named Lhasa. To elevate his new empire and forge alliances with China and Nepal, Gampo sought to import their dominant religion, Buddhism. He saw it as a means to integrate Tibet into the sophisticated political and economic networks of the region. But he faced a practical impossibility. Buddhism is a philosophy of logic and scripture, requiring a mastery of thousands of intricate texts. Importing it into a country without an alphabet was a logistical dead end. Gampo's first move was to send his minister, Thonmi Sambodha, to India. His specific mission was to study Sanskrit, decode its phonetic structure, and design a written script for the Tibetan language from the ground up. Look at the precision of the gold lettering on this manuscript. This script was the breakthrough Gampo needed. It allowed the court to move past oral tradition and begin the massive undertaking of translating thousands of foreign religious texts into a local format. The invention of the alphabet triggered a systematic transition. It gave Tibet the infrastructure to move from a culture of oral memory to one of recorded law, history, and standardized religious ideology. Gampo deepened this transformation through strategic marriages to Princess Brikudi of Nepal and Princess Wencheng of China. These queens brought more than just political ties. They arrived with libraries of wisdom, medical texts, and foundational Buddhist artifacts. However, the ancient shamanistic tradition of the land remained a powerful psychological barrier. Princess Wencheng reportedly had a vision of the Himalayas as a gargantuan sprawled demoness, a personification of the untamed land resisting the new culture. To suppress this resistance, Gampo commissioned 13 temples. As this map shows, they were positioned at specific geographic coordinates, striking the demoness's wrists, ankles, and organs like iron pins to claim the landscape for the new religion. At the center of this network was the Jokong Temple in Lhasa. It was built directly over what was believed to be the creature's heart center, physically anchoring Gampo's spiritual and political authority in the capital. Gampo mapped the new religion directly onto the physical geography of the plateau. By building this network, he sought to permanently pin the old shamanistic order beneath a layer of stone and timber. A century later, King Trisong Detsen inherited these landmarks. His goal was to move past local temples and scale Gampo's early work into massive, state-sponsored institutions. He financed the construction of Samye, Tibet's first official monastery. This vast complex became a hub for the empire's intellectual life, and in 779, it hosted the ordination of the first 7 Tibetan monks. But the empire's growth created an ideological rift. Because Buddhism had been imported from both China and India, 2 clashing schools of thought were now competing for dominance in the king's court. Detsen resolved this through the Samye Debate, a 2-year philosophical contest between Indian and Chinese masters. At its conclusion, Detsen officially adopted the Indian tradition as the state's sole religious orthodoxy. By picking a winner and funding centralized translation projects, Detsen transformed Buddhism into a unified state ideology, backed by the full weight of the imperial treasury. In the 9th century, King Ralpachen took this institutionalization to its extreme. He began hardwiring the monastery system into the state's legal and economic foundations. Ralpachen enforced absolute standardization. He mandated that all religious translations come exclusively from Sanskrit and funded a massive new lexicon to ensure that technical philosophical terms were recorded identically across the empire. His personal devotion was public and absolute. He earned the nickname the Man with Long Braids by sitting in court and placing the ends of his hair under the seats of monks, visually demonstrating that the crown was now subservient to the clergy. This chart illustrates his economic policy, a mandatory tax code where 7 lay families' resources were funneled directly to support a single monk. He also introduced severe penalties for disrespecting clergy, placing monks at the very top of the social pyramid, shielded by ironclad laws. By the end of Ralpachen's reign, the line between church and state was gone. He had built a unified theocracy, but his aggressive redistribution of wealth made the empire's political structure dangerously fragile. The nobility eventually revolted. Ralpachen's extreme devotion and the heavy taxation required to sustain the monks had created a boiling political resentment among the traditional elites. In 838, Ralpachen was assassinated by his brother, Langdharma. Upon taking the throne, Langdharma immediately began a violent campaign to dismantle the Buddhist institutions, closing monasteries and persecuting the clergy. This internal violence fractured the central government. Within a few years, the unified Tibetan Empire collapsed into a fractured Dark Age known as the Era of Fragmentation. The imperial state designed by the three kings was utterly destroyed. The political power they spent a century consolidating simply vanished from the plateau. But while the political empire died, the specific cultural tools the kings had engineered were now too deeply embedded to be erased. The alphabet, the standardized libraries, and the monastic framework had become part of the land's fundamental infrastructure. This knowledge persisted in the shadows of the fragmentation, surviving long after the last king was gone. These resilient systems eventually re-emerged to define modern Tibetan identity. The institutions we see today are the direct descendants of the linguistic and religious standards set during that imperial era. The empire of the Dharma kings was short-lived, collapsing under the weight of its own mandates. Yet the foundational tools they built, from the script to the scripture, remained embedded. They became a persistent infrastructure that outlasted the fall of the state, governing the logic of Tibetan culture for more than a millennium.